should have listened to the sign. That's the thought that haunts me every single night, replaying over and over in my head like a broken record. If we had just turned around when we saw those weathered wooden letters nailed to that old oak tree, maybe my friends would still be here. Maybe I wouldn't wake up in cold sweats hearing those massive footsteps thundering through my dreams. But we didn't listen. We laughed it off, made jokes, and walked straight into hell. It was supposed to be a simple day hike. Nothing fancy, nothing extreme. Just 3 friends looking to get away from the city for a few hours and breathe some fresh air. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, ever since work started getting too stressful, and we realized we hadn't spent quality time together in months. The weather forecast was perfect, clear skies with temperatures in the mid-70s, and we'd picked what looked like an easy trail on the map. I met up with my 2 buddies early that Saturday morning. One had been my roommate in college and was always the adventurous type, the guy who'd suggest climbing on rooftops or exploring abandoned buildings just for the thrill of it. The other was more cautious by nature but loved the outdoors, and had suggested this particular forest because he'd heard it had some beautiful waterfalls deeper in. We loaded our backpacks with the usual supplies, water bottles, granola bars, a first aid kit, and our phones for pictures. None of us were serious hikers, just regular guys who enjoyed getting out of the concrete jungle once in a while. We figured we'd spend maybe 4 or 5 hours total on the trail, take some photos, and be back in town by dinner time. The drive to the trailhead took about an hour and a half, winding through increasingly rural roads until we were surrounded by nothing but trees. We passed maybe 3 other cars the entire last half hour of the drive. When we finally reached the parking area, it was just a small gravel lot that could fit maybe 8 vehicles. There was only one other car there, an old pickup truck that looked like it had seen better days. We grabbed our gear and started looking for the trail markers. The forest was thick with towering pines and oaks, their canopy so dense that even in the bright morning sun, the undergrowth was dim and cool. Birds chirped overhead, and we could hear the distant sound of running water, probably one of those waterfalls we'd come to see. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when we came across it. There, nailed to a massive oak tree at about eye level, was a hand-painted wooden sign that looked like it had been there for years. The paint was faded and chipped, but the message was still perfectly readable. Warning: Bigfoot activity is high in this area. You may be subject to encounters. Hike at your own risk. We all stopped dead in our tracks when we saw it. My college buddy started laughing, that kind of loud, obnoxious laugh that echoes through the trees. My cautious friend wasn't laughing. He stood there studying the sign, running his fingers along the weathered wood, noting how old and genuine it appeared. My college buddy dismissed it as a scare tactic, probably some local trying to keep city folks away from his secret fishing spot. I wasn't sure what to think. The sign did look genuine, weathered in a way that takes years of exposure to rain and sun. But Bigfoot, we were 3 grown men with college educations and jobs and mortgages. My cautious friend suggested finding a different trail, but my college buddy refused to turn around after driving all this way because of what he considered a ridiculous sign. He had a point. We'd gotten up early, made the long drive, and cleared our entire Saturday for this hike. It would be silly to give up before we'd even really started because of what was almost certainly just local folklore. After a brief debate, we decided to continue. My cautious friend reluctantly agreed, insisting we stick together and turn around immediately if anything weird happened. My college buddy was already walking past the sign, making jokes about finding Bigfoot tracks to post on social media. Past the warning sign, the trail was actually well maintained. Someone had clearly spent time clearing fallen branches and marking the path with small reflective tags tied to trees every 50 yards or so. The undergrowth wasn't too thick and the walking was easy. For the first hour, we made good time. The forest was beautiful in that peaceful, cathedral-like way that old-growth woods can be. Shafts of sunlight filtered down through the canopy, illuminating patches of ferns and wildflowers. The air smelled clean and piney, with that earthy undertone you only get deep in the woods. We talked about work, complained about our bosses, and caught up on recent events. My college buddy kept making jokes about the sign, doing exaggerated Bigfoot impressions, and claiming he could smell Sasquatch musk every time we passed a particularly dense thicket. Even my cautious friend started loosening up and laughing. The morning was so perfect, the forest so peaceful, that the warning sign began to feel like a distant memory. We stopped for a water break about an hour and a half in, sitting on a fallen log that made a natural bench. The forest was alive with bird songs and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. A squirrel chattered at us from a nearby tree, probably annoyed that we'd invaded its territory. My cautious friend expressed relief that we'd decided to keep going. The whole Bigfoot thing seemed ridiculous when sitting in the middle of a perfectly normal forest on a beautiful Saturday morning. We finished our water and kept moving deeper into the woods. The trail started climbing gradually, winding up the side of what seemed to be a decent-sized hill or small mountain. The trees got even taller and the canopy thicker, filtering the sunlight down to a greenish twilight even though it was still mid-morning. About 2.5 hours into our hike, we came to a fork in the trail. The main path continued straight ahead, while a smaller, less maintained trail branched off to the right. There was no sign indicating which way to go or where either path led. My college buddy suggested taking the side trail, claiming it looked more interesting than the tourist route. My cautious friend pointed out that it looked unmaintained and overgrown. The smaller trail was partially blocked by fallen branches and looked harder to follow, but it also looked more wild, more like what you'd expect from a real wilderness adventure. My college buddy was already heading toward the side trail, dismissing concerns about getting lost. We had phones, we had water, and it was a beautiful day. The decision was made. The side trail was definitely more challenging. We had to duck under low-hanging branches and step over fallen logs every few hundred yards. The path wasn't marked as clearly as the main trail, but it was still followable if you paid attention. The forest felt different here too, quieter somehow, with fewer bird songs and less rustling in the underbrush. After about 45 minutes on the side trail, we started hearing the sound of running water getting stronger. The promised waterfall was somewhere up ahead. We were all getting excited to finally reach our destination and take a break. But then we saw something that made us all stop in our tracks. About 10 feet off the trail, hanging from the branches of a large pine tree, was what looked like a set of clothes. At first glance, it seemed like someone had hung their laundry to dry, which would have been weird enough in the middle of the forest. But as we got closer, we realized it was something much stranger. The clothes, a flannel shirt, a pair of jeans, and what might have been a jacket, were arranged in a rough human shape, as if someone had tried to make a scarecrow. Sticks and branches had been stuffed inside the sleeves and pant legs to give them form, and dried leaves and grass were poking out at odd angles. The whole thing was suspended about 10 feet off the ground, hanging from multiple branches like some kind of twisted marionette. What made it really unsettling was how deliberate it looked. This wasn't just clothes that had accidentally gotten caught in a tree or blown around by the wind. Someone or something had carefully constructed this display and positioned it where it would be visible from the trail. We all stood there staring at it for a long moment. The clothes swayed slightly in the breeze, making the whole thing look almost alive. There was something deeply wrong about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My college buddy suggested it was probably just some weird art project, though his voice lacked the confident tone it had earlier. My cautious friend was studying the scarecrow intently, his face pale. He pointed out how high it was positioned, a good 10 feet off the ground, but the lowest branches that could support that kind of weight were even higher. A normal person would need a ladder or climbing gear to reach that high, but there was no evidence of either. My college buddy was getting visibly annoyed with our hesitation, dismissing it as probably just some local prankster trying to scare hikers. He started walking again, leaving us standing there staring up at the scarecrow. After a moment, my cautious friend and I reluctantly followed, but the mood had definitely changed. The easy conversation and joking around from earlier had stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. As we continued on the side trail, the forest began to change around us. The bird songs that had been constant companions all morning gradually faded away until we were walking in near complete silence. Even the rustling of small animals in the underbrush disappeared. The only sounds were our own footsteps and the increasingly loud rush of water somewhere ahead. The trees grew larger and more ancient looking, their trunks easily 4 or 5 feet in diameter. Some of them had to be hundreds of years old. The canopy above us became so thick that very little sunlight reached the forest floor, giving everything a dim, twilight quality, even though it was still the middle of the day. My cautious friend whispered about how quiet everything had suddenly become. I'd noticed it too. The silence was so complete, it was almost oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. In all my hiking experience, I'd never been in woods this quiet. There should have been something, birds, insects, squirrels, anything. But there was nothing except the distant sound of running water. My college buddy attributed it to the time of day, suggesting animals were less active during the afternoon heat. But it wasn't particularly hot under the thick canopy. If anything, it was getting cooler as we climbed higher and the shade deepened. The silence felt unnatural, like something had scared away every living creature for miles around. We kept walking, but the easy camaraderie from earlier was completely gone. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, occasionally glancing around at the towering trees that seemed to press in closer on both sides of the trail. The path itself was getting narrower and less defined, sometimes disappearing entirely before picking up again 20 or 30 feet ahead. After another 30 minutes of hiking in uncomfortable silence, the sound of water became much louder. We could tell we were getting close to the stream or waterfall that had been our destination all along. The prospect of finally reaching our goal and taking a real break lifted our spirits slightly. We pushed through the last section of undergrowth and emerged into a small clearing beside a beautiful mountain stream. The water was crystal clear, flowing over smooth rocks and creating small pools perfect for drinking from. Sunlight streamed down through a gap in the canopy, making the water sparkle like diamonds. My college buddy dropped his backpack and headed straight for the stream. The water was shockingly cold, probably fed by snowmelt from higher up the mountain, and it tasted better than any bottled water I'd ever had. We splashed it on our faces and the backs of our necks, washing away the sweat and fatigue from the long hike. The clearing felt open and safe compared to the oppressive silence of the forest we'd just walked through. Here, at least, we could see in all directions, and there was enough sunlight to feel like it was still daytime. For a few minutes, everything felt normal again. We were just 3 friends enjoying a beautiful spot in nature, exactly like we'd planned. The weird scarecrow in the tree felt like something from another day entirely, and even the warning sign seemed like a distant memory. But then my college buddy, who had been splashing around in the shallow water, suddenly went completely still. My college buddy stared upstream, his voice barely audible over the sound of the stream as he told us to look. My cautious friend and I followed his gaze up the water, squinting against the reflected sunlight. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just more water flowing between the rocks, more trees lining the banks. Then I saw it, about 50 yards upstream, crouched at the edge of the water like it was drinking, was the largest figure I'd ever seen. At first, my brain tried to process it as a person, maybe another hiker who had arrived at the stream from a different trail. But as my eyes adjusted and focused, I realized this was definitely not human. The thing was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, even while crouched down. Its entire body was covered in thick, dark brown hair that looked coarse and matted. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, much wider than any human could be, and its arms hung down almost to the ground even while it was bent over the water. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, none of us moved. The creature was completely motionless too, its head bent down toward the stream as if it was drinking or fishing. Maybe it hadn't noticed us yet. Maybe we could back away slowly and get out of there without disturbing it. Then it raised its head and looked directly at us. I'll never forget those eyes as long as I live. They were intelligent, not the blank stare of an animal, but the focused, calculating gaze of something that was thinking, evaluating, deciding. The face was a nightmarish blend of human and ape features, with a prominent brow ridge and a mouth that seemed too large for its head. But those eyes were what really got me. They were looking at us the way a predator looks at prey. We all scrambled backward from the stream, trying to put distance between ourselves and the thing watching us. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands were shaking as I tried to grab my backpack without taking my eyes off the creature. The thing straightened up to its full height, and I realized just how massive it really was. Standing upright, it had to be at least 8 feet tall, possibly 9. Its chest was barrel-shaped and covered in the same coarse brown hair as the rest of its body. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging down past its knees, and ended in hands that looked like they could crush a bowling ball. But the most terrifying thing was how it moved. This wasn't some clumsy bear standing on its hind legs or a person in a costume trying to fool us. It moved with fluid, natural grace, shifting its weight and adjusting its stance like something that was perfectly comfortable walking upright. There was an intelligence to its movements that was more unsettling than any roar or aggressive display could have been. For another few seconds, we all just stared at each other across the stream. The creature seemed as surprised to see us as we were to see it. Its head tilted slightly to one side, studying us with those disturbingly intelligent eyes. Then my cautious friend stumbled backward over a rock and fell hard on his backside. The sound of his fall echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and its entire demeanor changed instantly. What had been curious observation became focused attention. It took a step forward into the stream, water splashing around its massive feet. We ran, we crashed back into the forest like our lives depended on it, which they probably did. Branches whipped across our faces and tore at our clothes as we fought our way through the undergrowth, trying to find the trail we'd followed to the stream. Behind us, we could hear massive splashing as the creature crossed the water. My college buddy was in the lead, followed by my cautious friend with me bringing up the rear. We were all in decent shape, but running through dense forest is exhausting work. Every step was an obstacle. Roots to trip over, branches to duck under, rocks to avoid. We were making a tremendous amount of noise, crashing through the woods like a herd of panicked deer. But behind us, the noise was even worse. The footsteps following us sounded like thunder. Each step shook the ground so hard I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my hiking boots. Whatever was chasing us was big enough and heavy enough that its running gait was like a series of small earthquakes. And it was gaining on us. We'd maybe covered 100 yards from the stream when we heard the first vocalization from behind us. It wasn't a roar exactly, more like a combination of a growl and a scream that seemed to come from something with lungs the size of garbage cans. The sound was so loud and so close that it felt like it was coming from right behind my shoulder. My cautious friend was gasping as he ran, panic evident in his voice. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was maybe 20 yards back and closing fast. Seeing it in motion was even more terrifying than seeing it standing still by the stream. It ran with a loping, powerful gait that covered enormous amounts of ground with each stride. Its arms swung wide as it moved, knocking aside small trees and branches like they were twigs. And its face, the expression on its face was one of pure rage. Its mouth was open, revealing teeth that looked designed for tearing meat, and those intelligent eyes were locked onto us with unmistakable intent. This wasn't just a startled animal trying to defend its territory. This thing was hunting us. My college buddy shouted that he could see the trail ahead. Through the trees, I could make out the clearer path we'd followed earlier. If we could reach it, maybe we could move faster on the more open ground. Maybe we could outrun this thing and make it back to the car. But we were all slowing down. 3 hours of hiking followed by an all-out sprint through dense forest was taking its toll. My lungs felt like they were on fire and my legs were starting to feel like jelly. My cautious friend was stumbling more frequently, and even my college buddy's pace was noticeably dropping. The footsteps behind us were getting closer. We reached the main trail and tried to pick up speed on the clearer ground, but it was too late. The creature burst out of the forest behind us like a freight train, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to move. My college buddy was still in the lead when it happened. The creature covered the last 15 yards between us in what seemed like 2 massive strides, then swung one of its enormous arms in a sweeping motion that caught him in the middle of his back. The impact launched him through the air like he'd been hit by a car. He flew at least 10 feet before crashing into a tree trunk with a sickening thud, then crumpled to the ground and didn't move. My cautious friend tried to change direction, diving to the left to avoid the same fate, but the creature was already turning toward him. One massive hand grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around, then the other hand delivered a punch to his chest that drove him to the ground instantly. I kept running, pure terror overriding any thought of trying to help my friends. But I'd only made it a few more steps when something hit me in the back of the head with the force of a sledgehammer. The world exploded into stars and darkness, and I felt myself falling forward onto the trail. I don't know how long I was out, but when I started coming back to consciousness, the first thing I became aware of was pain. My head felt like it had been split open with an axe, and there was a warm, sticky feeling that I realized was blood running down the back of my neck. I was lying face down on the trail with my cheek pressed against the dirt. Every time I tried to move, waves of nausea and dizziness washed over me. But I could hear things happening around me, sounds that made my blood run cold, heavy breathing, grunting, and a dragging sound like something large being pulled across the ground. I forced myself to open my eyes just a crack, trying not to move my head or make any sound that might draw attention to the fact that I was conscious. Through my blurred vision, I could see the creature about 20 feet away. It was bent over my college buddy's motionless form, grabbing him under the arms and starting to drag him back toward the forest. The thing was even more terrifying up close. Its hair was coarse and filthy, matted with mud and debris. Its hands were like massive mitts, easily twice the size of human hands, with thick fingers that ended in what looked like black claws. Its face, when I could see it in profile, was a nightmare combination of human and animal features, intelligent but utterly alien. But the worst part was the smell. Even from 20 feet away, the stench was overwhelming. It was like a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else. Something wild and primal that made every instinct in my body scream danger. I watched in horror as the creature dragged my college buddy into the trees and disappeared from view. His body left a clear trail in the dirt and fallen leaves, showing exactly where they'd gone. For several minutes, I could hear the sound of movement getting fainter and fainter as they went deeper into the forest. Then silence. I stayed perfectly still, fighting the urge to call out for my friends or try to help them. Every survival instinct I had was telling me to stay quiet, stay hidden, and wait for an opportunity to escape. But the waiting was agony. What was happening to my friends? Were they still alive? Was the creature going to come back for me? After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes, I heard the heavy footsteps returning. The creature emerged from the forest and walked directly to where my cautious friend was lying motionless on the trail. It grabbed him in the same way it had grabbed my college buddy and began dragging him toward the trees. This time I got a better look at its face, and what I saw there made my blood freeze. There was intelligence in its expression, but it was a cold, calculating intelligence. This thing knew exactly what it was doing. It wasn't acting on instinct or defending itself. It was systematically collecting us like trophies. My cautious friend's body also left a clear trail as he was dragged into the forest. Within minutes, the creature and my friend had disappeared among the trees, and once again I was left alone with the silence and the stench that lingered in the air. I knew it would be coming back for me next. Fighting through the pain and dizziness from my head injury, I forced myself to think clearly. The creature obviously thought I was unconscious or dead, which was the only reason I was still lying on the trail instead of being dragged off like my friends. But how long would that last? When it came back and found me gone, it would start hunting. I had to hide, and I had to do it fast. Slowly, trying not to make any sound, I raised my head and looked around the area where I'd fallen. The trail itself offered no cover. It was too open, too obvious, but about 15 feet to my right, there was a thick cluster of bushes growing around the base of a large oak tree. In the dim light, I could see what looked like a natural depression in the ground beneath the bushes, probably carved out by years of water runoff. Moving as quietly as possible, I began crawling toward the bushes. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my head, and I had to stop several times to fight off nausea. The back of my head was definitely bleeding. I could feel it matting my hair and running down my neck. But I couldn't worry about that now. When I reached the oak tree, I discovered that the depression was even better than I'd hoped. Erosion had carved out a natural hollow about 3 feet deep and just wide enough for a person to curl up in. The overhanging bushes would provide cover from above, and fallen leaves had accumulated in the bottom, offering natural camouflage. I squeezed myself into the hollow and began grabbing handfuls of dirt, leaves, and debris, rubbing them all over my clothes and exposed skin. If that thing could track by scent, and I was pretty sure it could, I needed to mask my human smell as much as possible. The dirt was damp and cold, and it stuck to the blood on my head and neck, but I didn't care. I covered myself with as much natural material as I could find until I looked more like a pile of forest debris than a person. Then I curled up as small as possible and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The heavy footsteps announced the creature's return long before I could see it. The ground vibrated under my body with each step, and I could hear branches snapping as it pushed through the forest. Then it emerged onto the trail, and I got my first really good look at it. It was even larger than I'd thought. Standing upright on the trail where I'd been lying, it had to be at least 8.5 feet tall. Its body was massively muscled, built like a linebacker, but scaled up to impossible proportions. The hair covering its body was thick and coarse, ranging from dark brown on its back and shoulders to lighter brown on its chest and arms. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. In the better light of the trail, I could see that while it was definitely not human, there was something disturbingly human-like about its features. The eyes were large and dark, set deep under a prominent brow ridge. The nose was flat and wide, more ape-like than human, but the mouth was the most unsettling feature of all. It was too large, stretching almost from ear to ear, and when it opened slightly as the creature breathed, I could see rows of yellowed teeth that looked designed for tearing flesh. The creature stood exactly where I had been lying, turning its head slowly from side to side as it studied the area. It was clearly looking for me, trying to figure out where I'd gone. Its nostrils flared as it tested the air, and I realized with growing terror that it was trying to pick up my scent. From my hiding place 15 feet away, the smell was overwhelming. It was like being downwind from a zoo exhibit that hadn't been cleaned in months, mixed with the metallic scent of blood and something else. Something wild and predatory that made every primitive alarm in my brain start screaming. The creature took a few steps in different directions, clearly confused by my disappearance. It bent down and examined the spot where I'd been lying, running its massive hands over the disturbed dirt and leaves. Then it straightened up and let out a sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. It was part roar, part scream, and part something else entirely, a vocalization that no known animal makes. The sound was so loud it seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees and reverberating through the forest. It was a sound of pure rage and frustration, the kind of noise a predator makes when it realizes its prey has escaped. Birds that I hadn't even realized were still in the area exploded from the trees in all directions, filling the air with the frantic beating of wings. Small animals that had been hiding in the underbrush broke cover and fled. Even the insects seemed to go silent. But the most terrifying thing was that the creature's outburst attracted a response from somewhere deeper in the forest. Another vocalization, fainter but clearly from the same type of creature, echoed back through the trees. Then another from a different direction, and another. There wasn't just one of these things. There were several of them, and they were communicating. What happened next was like something out of my worst nightmare. The creature that had been standing on the trail lifted its head and made a series of grunting calls toward the forest. Within minutes, I could hear heavy footsteps approaching from multiple directions. They were organizing a search. From my hiding place, I watched as two more creatures emerged from the trees. They were slightly smaller than the first one, but still massive, probably 7 feet tall and built like professional wrestlers. They moved with the same fluid, natural grace as the first creature, but there was something different about their behavior. Where the first one had seemed angry and frustrated, these two appeared more methodical, more focused. The three creatures gathered in the center of the trail and began making a series of low, grunting sounds back and forth. It was clearly some form of communication, though unlike any language I'd ever heard. The sounds were too complex and varied to be simple animal calls, but too alien to be human speech. After a few minutes of this exchange, they split up. The original creature headed back toward the stream, probably to check if I'd somehow circled around that way. One of the new arrivals went into the forest on the left side of the trail, while the third took the right side. They were methodically searching the area, and it was only a matter of time before one of them found my hiding spot. I pressed myself deeper into the hollow under the oak tree, trying to become one with the earth and debris I'd covered myself with. The dirt and leaves scratched at my face and worked their way into my mouth, but I didn't dare move to clear them away. I could only lie there and listen as the heavy footsteps moved through the forest around me. The creature searching the right side of the trail was moving in my direction. I could hear it pushing through the undergrowth, snapping branches and disturbing leaves as it methodically checked every possible hiding place. Each footstep sounded like it was getting closer to my position. Through the covering of leaves and branches, I caught glimpses of it moving between the trees. It would stop at each large rock or fallen log, examining it carefully before moving on to the next potential hiding spot. Its search pattern was intelligent and thorough. This wasn't random wandering, but a systematic hunt. When it reached a large boulder about 30 feet from my hiding place, it stopped and raised its head, testing the air with those flared nostrils. For a terrifying moment, I thought it had caught my scent, despite all the dirt and debris I'd covered myself with. It turned slowly in my direction, those dark eyes scanning the forest floor. I held my breath and tried to make myself as small as possible. The creature took 2 steps toward my hiding place, then stopped again. It tilted its head to one side, listening intently for any sound that might give away my position. Time seemed to stretch on forever. My lungs were screaming for air, but I didn't dare breathe. My head wound was throbbing in time with my heartbeat, and I could feel blood continuing to seep into the dirt beneath me. Black spots were dancing at the edges of my vision, and I knew I was close to passing out again. Just when I thought I couldn't hold my breath any longer, the creature turned away and continued its search in a different direction. I let out the smallest, quietest exhale I could manage and tried to refill my lungs without making any sound. For the next several hours, I lay in that hollow listening to the creatures search the forest around me. They were incredibly thorough, checking and rechecking areas multiple times. Occasionally, I would hear them communicating with each other through those low grunting calls, and sometimes one would respond with what sounded like frustration or confusion. As the afternoon wore on, the searches became less frequent and more distant. Maybe they were expanding their search area, or maybe they were starting to give up. But I didn't dare move from my hiding place. Every time the forest would go quiet for more than a few minutes, I'd start to hope they were gone. Then I'd hear those massive footsteps again, sometimes uncomfortably close to my position. The pain in my head was getting worse as the hours passed. What had started as a sharp, localized ache had spread into a constant, throbbing agony that made it hard to think clearly. As the sun began to set and the forest grew dimmer, the search sounds gradually faded away entirely. I waited another hour after the last footsteps had disappeared before I dared to move even slightly. My entire body had gone stiff from lying motionless for so long, and pins and needles shot through my arms and legs as I tried to shift position. The back of my head felt sticky with dried blood, and when I gingerly touched the wound, I could feel a gash about 3 inches long that was still slowly bleeding. I was definitely concussed. The world kept swimming in and out of focus, and I felt nauseous whenever I moved too quickly. But I was alive, and as far as I could tell, I was alone. Slowly, carefully, I began to extract myself from the hollow beneath the oak tree. Every movement was agony, both from my injuries and from muscles that had been cramped in the same position for hours. The debris and dirt I'd covered myself with fell away as I moved, leaving me looking like I'd been buried alive. When I finally managed to crawl out of the hiding place and sit up against the tree trunk, the world spun violently around me. I had to close my eyes and lean my head back against the bark until the dizziness passed. When I opened them again, the trail looked exactly the same as it had when the attack happened, except for the dark stains in the dirt where my friends had been lying. The sight of those bloodstains hit me harder than I'd expected. This wasn't a nightmare I was going to wake up from. My friends were really gone, dragged away by some creature that shouldn't exist, and I was alone in the middle of nowhere with a serious head injury and no way to call for help. My phone was still in my backpack, which was lying on the trail about 10 feet away from where I'd fallen. I crawled over to it on my hands and knees, not trusting my balance enough to try standing yet. When I managed to pull out my phone, the screen was cracked but still functional. No signal, not even 1 bar. I'd expected as much. We'd been losing signal steadily as we hiked deeper into the forest. But seeing those empty signal bars was still devastating. There would be no calling for help, no GPS to guide me out, no way to contact the outside world. I was completely on my own. Sitting there on the trail with my broken phone in my hands, I was trying to figure out what to do next when the wind shifted slightly. Immediately, that horrible stench filled the air again, stronger than ever, like the source was very close by. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. They were still here. I scrambled back toward my hiding place as quietly as possible, fighting off waves of dizziness from the sudden movement. Just as I reached the oak tree, I heard a low grunt from somewhere in the forest to my left, followed by an answering call from the right side of the trail. They had me surrounded. I squeezed back into the hollow beneath the bushes, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it would give away my position. The smell was getting stronger by the minute, mixed with something else now, a musky, sweaty odor that reminded me of a locker room that had never been cleaned. Through the gaps in the branches above me, I could see a massive shadow moving across the trail. One of the creatures was standing almost directly over my hiding spot, so close I could have reached out and touched its feet if I'd been insane enough to try. The smell was now so intense it was making my eyes water. I had to fight the urge to gag or cough, knowing that any sound would immediately give away my position. The creature above me was breathing heavily, and each exhale brought a fresh wave of that nauseating stench down into my hiding place. For several minutes, it just stood there. I could hear it moving slightly, shifting its weight from foot to foot, occasionally making soft, grunting sounds. It knew I was somewhere nearby. It could probably smell me despite all the dirt and debris I'd covered myself with. But it couldn't pinpoint my exact location. Then, without warning, it let out another one of those earth-shaking roars. The sound was so loud and so close that it felt like being inside a thunderclap. My ears rang, and for a moment I thought the sheer volume might have damaged my hearing permanently. But worse than the noise itself was what happened next. The roar was answered by other calls from different parts of the forest. At least 3 or 4 distinct voices, all coming from different directions. And they all sounded closer than before. The creature above me made a series of quick, grunting sounds toward the other calls, then began moving away from my hiding place. But I could still hear the heavy footsteps of the others moving through the forest, getting closer to the trail. They weren't giving up, they were regrouping. I spent the rest of the night in that hollow, listening to the creatures search the forest around me. They took turns patrolling the area, sometimes coming close enough that I could smell them through my covering of debris. The methodical nature of their search was almost more terrifying than the initial attack had been. These weren't mindless beasts. They were intelligent predators working together to find me. Several times during the night, I heard them communicating through those low, grunting calls. The sounds carried a complexity that suggested real language, not just animal vocalizations. They were coordinating their efforts, sharing information about their search. The pain in my head was getting worse as the hours passed. What had started as a sharp, localized ache had spread into a constant, throbbing agony that made it hard to think clearly. I was almost certainly concussed, and the continued blood loss was making me weak and lightheaded. But I forced myself to stay conscious and alert. My life depended on it. As dawn approached, the search activity gradually decreased. The heavy footsteps became less frequent, and the grunting communications faded. Maybe they were giving up, or maybe they were simply waiting for better light to continue their hunt. When the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the forest canopy, I was exhausted beyond description. I'd been hiding motionless for nearly 12 hours, most of it in complete darkness, with a serious head injury and no food or water, except what I'd managed to drink earlier at the stream. But the growing light revealed something that gave me the first hope I'd felt since the attack. Through the trees in the distance, I could see what looked like a power line cutting through the forest. Power lines meant civilization. They meant roads and houses and people who could help me. Even if I had to follow the lines for miles, they would eventually lead me out of this nightmare forest and back to the world of normal human beings. Fighting through the pain and weakness from my injuries, I slowly extracted myself from the hiding place once more. The forest seemed quiet, no sounds of movement, no trace of that horrible stench in the air. But I moved with extreme caution anyway, crawling from tree to tree and stopping frequently to listen for any signs of danger. It took me nearly an hour to cover the half-mile to the power line corridor, moving slowly through the undergrowth and pausing behind cover every few minutes. When I finally reached the cleared area beneath the lines, I almost cried with relief. The open space was like a highway through the forest, offering easy walking and clear sightlines in both directions. More importantly, I could see that the lines led down the mountain toward what looked like a valley with scattered lights in the distance. Signs of human habitation. I started following the power lines downhill, staying in the center of the cleared corridor where I could see any approaching threats from a long distance. For the first time since the attack, I felt like I might actually make it out alive. The walking was much easier on the maintained right-of-way. There were no roots to trip over, no branches to duck under, no dense undergrowth to fight through. I was able to make steady progress despite my injuries and exhaustion. But after about an hour, I heard something behind me that made my blood freeze. The unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor. I turned around and saw, about a quarter-mile back up the hill, a dark figure moving along the same path I was taking. Even at that distance, there was no mistaking what it was. The creature had found the power line corridor too, and it was following me down the mountain. But something was different about its behavior. Instead of the methodical hunting approach it had used in the forest, this seemed more like casual pursuit. It wasn't trying to catch up with me quickly or moving with any particular urgency. It was just following, matching my pace, staying about the same distance behind. It was toying with me. The realization was more terrifying than an outright attack would have been. This thing was intelligent enough to understand that I was trapped on the power line corridor with nowhere to hide and no way to escape. It could catch me whenever it wanted to. It was just choosing not to, for reasons I couldn't understand and didn't want to think about. I tried to increase my pace, but my injured body wouldn't cooperate. The combination of blood loss, exhaustion, and head trauma had pushed me close to my physical limits. Each step was an effort, and I was stumbling more frequently as my coordination continued to deteriorate. Behind me, the creature maintained its steady pace, never getting closer but never falling behind either. In the growing daylight, I could occasionally get glimpses of it when I looked back, a massive, hair-covered form moving along the corridor with that fluid, unnatural grace. The lights in the valley below were definitely getting closer, but so slowly it was agonizing. At my current pace, it would take at least another 2 or 3 hours to reach them. I wasn't sure I could stay conscious that long, and I definitely wasn't sure the creature would continue to simply follow rather than attack. Then I heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of a car engine. The sound was coming from somewhere ahead and to the right, beyond a ridge that blocked my view of that part of the valley. But it was definitely a car, and where there were cars, there were roads, and where there were roads, there were people. I immediately changed direction, leaving the power line corridor and heading toward the sound. It meant going back into the forest, which was terrifying, but it also meant the possibility of reaching help much sooner than following the power lines all the way to the valley floor. Behind me, I heard the creature let out what sounded like a frustrated grunt when it realized I'd left the corridor. But I didn't look back to see if it was following. I just pushed forward through the trees, guided by the increasingly clear sound of traffic. The forest here was less dense than the areas we'd hiked through earlier, with more open spaces between the trees and less undergrowth to fight through. I could make better time, and the multiple car sounds I was hearing suggested I was approaching a reasonably busy road rather than just some isolated forest track. After about 20 minutes of hiking toward the traffic sounds, I crested a small ridge and saw the most beautiful sight of my life. A 2-lane asphalt road winding through the valley below, with cars passing by every few minutes. I half ran, half stumbled down the hillside toward the road, no longer caring about noise or stealth. All that mattered was reaching that pavement and flagging down help before I collapsed completely. When I finally staggered out of the tree line and onto the shoulder of the road, I was covered in dirt and blood. My clothes were torn, and I probably looked like I'd been hit by a truck. But I was alive, and I was back in the world of normal human beings. The first car that saw me pulled over immediately. The driver was an elderly man who took one look at my condition and started asking if I needed an ambulance. I tried to explain what had happened, but I'm not sure how coherent I was. The words came out in fragments: attacked by creature, friends missing, hiding in forest, need help. He helped me into his car and drove me straight to the nearest hospital, about 20 minutes away in a small mountain town. As we pulled away from the forest, I looked back through the rear window and thought I saw a large shadow standing at the tree line, watching us leave. But it might have been my imagination. The head injury was making it hard to trust what I was seeing. The doctors at the hospital said I had a severe concussion, a 3-inch laceration on the back of my head that required 12 stitches, and was suffering from exhaustion and mild hypothermia. They kept me for observation for 2 days, running tests to make sure there was no permanent brain damage. When I was finally coherent enough to give a detailed statement, I told the police everything exactly as it had happened. I expected them to dismiss my story as the ravings of a head injury patient, but the officer who took my statement was surprisingly receptive. He told me they get reports like this every couple of years, usually from hunters or hikers who go into the deep forest areas. Most people don't report them because they're afraid of being ridiculed, but I wasn't the first person to describe something like this. A search and rescue team went into the forest the next day to look for my friends. They found our original campsite by the stream, along with bloodstains and signs of a struggle. They also found both of my friends' backpacks, but no other trace of them. The search continued for a week, with teams covering hundreds of square miles of wilderness. They brought in tracking dogs, helicopter overflights, and thermal imaging equipment. But my friends were never found. Officially, they're listed as missing persons, presumed dead due to animal attack or misadventure. The case is still open, but no one expects them to be found alive after all this time. My friends and I thought we were just 3 regular guys taking a day hike through pretty scenery. We had no idea we were walking into a hunting ground where we would become the prey. Some forests have areas where hikers consistently disappear. Some have zones where all wildlife goes silent. Some have reports of structures built too high for humans to reach, or tracks too large to belong to any known animal. The signs are there. You just have to know what to look for. Don't make the same mistake we did. Don't ignore the warnings. Don't assume that monsters only exist in stories, because sometimes the stories are true, and sometimes the monsters are real. We should have listened to the sign. For more interesting stories like this, check this out.